Now broadcasting from beautiful downtown Tallahassee, it's Classic Movie Reviews with Snark.
Welcome to today's show. As always, you can subscribe to the show on iTunes or follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes. You can also go to snarkymoviereviews.com to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Today's movie is a Christmas favorite featuring some great stars. The film is The Bishop's Wife, 1947. This movie was remade as The Preacher's Wife in 1996 with Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston. Quite frankly, I have never watched the remake, failing to see how they could improve on the original. Cary Grant played Angel Dudley. Grant was born in England in 1904. At the age of 14, he left home and joined a comedy troupe. In 1920, he was selected to perform on Broadway. He stayed in the United States. His first film was This Is the Night, 1932, and his last film was a great comedy, Walk, Don't Run, 1966. In between, he made so many great movies from comedies to drama. I will just hit a few of the highlights. These films include Bringing Up Baby, 1938 with Katharine Hepburn, Gunga Din, 1939, The Philadelphia Story, 1940, My Favorite Wife, 1940, His Girl Friday, 1940, Destination Tokyo, 1943, Arsenic and Old Lace, 1944. Notorious, 1946 with Ingrid Bergman and Claude Rains. The Bishop's Wife, 1947. Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, 1948. I Was a Male War Bride, 1949. People Will Talk, 1951. To Catch a Thief, 1955 with Grace Kelly. Spy thriller North by Northwest, 1959, made with Eva Marie Saint. Operation Petticoat, 1959, A Touch of Mink, 1962, Charade, 1963, and Father Goose, 1964. At the age of 62, he retired from film and started raising a family. He died in 1986 at the age of 82. Loretta Young played the role of Julia Brougham, the bishop's wife. Young was born in Utah in 1913. By the age of 4, she was working as a child actor. She made her first film in 1917 and made another in 1921. In 1927, she had a small part in Naughty But Nice. Through the 1920s and 1930s, she made 6 to 9 films a year. In 1935, this beauty was in The Call of the Wild, 1935, with Clark Gable. Young became pregnant by Gable, who was married at the time. The whole thing was kept from the public, and she had her most important role to date with Kentucky, 1938. In 1947, Young won the Best Actress Oscar for The Farmer's Daughter, 1947. That same year, The Bishop's Wife, 1947, came out. In 1953, Young retired from film. She was on television through 1962. Young enjoyed her retirement and died in 2000 at her sister's home. Her sister was married to Ricardo Montalban. English actor David Niven played Henry Brougham, a.k.a. The Bishop. Niven attended Sandhurst Military Academy, which is the English equivalent of West Point, and served for 2 years in Malta with the Highland Light Infantry. He started making movies in 1932. He obtained larger roles in The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1936, The Prisoner of Zenda, 1937, and The Dawn Patrol, 1938. When World War II broke out, Niven joined the English Army. During the war, he made 2 wartime propaganda films, Spitfire, 1942, and The Way Ahead, 1944. After the war, he continued to make great movies. Some of the highlights are Around the World in 80 Days, 1956, My Man Godfrey, 1957, Please Don't Eat the Daisies, 1960, The Guns of Navarone, 1961, The Pink Panther, 1963, 55 Days in Peking, 1963, Casino Royale, 1967, Murder by Death, 1976, The Sea Wolves, 1980, Trial of the Pink Panther, 1982, and The Curse of the Pink Panther, 1983. Niven died in 1983 at the age of 73. Monty Woolley played down-and-out Professor Wortheridge. Woolley was born in 1888 in New York. He studied at Harvard and Yale and became an instructor at Yale. Woolley was extremely active in the theater. In 1936, at the age of 47, Woolley left academia to work professionally on the stage and in film. Woolley made films from 1937 to 55. However, his 2 best are arguably The Man Who Came to Dinner 1942, and The Bishop's Wife 1947. Woolley was active in radio and on television following his film career. He died in 1963 at the age of 74. James Gleason played a small role as Sylvester, the taxi driver. Born in New York in 1882, Gleason fought in the Spanish-American War. Following that war, he worked in stock theater. When World War I broke out, he enlisted again. Following that war, he started appearing on Broadway and writing for Broadway. In his career, he had 163 film and television credits. He is probably best known for his role in Here Comes Mr. Jordan 1941, which has been remade several times with different names. Gleason died in 1959 at the age of 76. Gladys Cooper played the role of hostile widow Mrs. Hamilton. Born in 1888, Cooper began working on stage by 1906. During World War I, she was a pinup favorite. Her first full-length film was in 1917. She had 73 television and film credits. She jumped between film and stage. Her last film was in 1969, and she died in 1971 at the age of 82. Elsa Lancaster played the role of the slightly offbeat maid, Matilda. We covered Lancaster in Episode 7, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. Sarah Hayden played the role of Henry's secretary, Mildred Castaway. Hayden was born in 1899 and has 116 movie and television credits. The only movie I will mention besides The Bishop's Wife 1947 is She-Wolf of London 1946. Hayden died in 1981. Robert J. Anderson was born in 1933. He was in It's a Wonderful Life 1946 and then The Bishop's Wife 1947 as a child actor. He had a total of 27 acting credits and worked in production for movies such as Demolition Man 1993 and Passenger 57 1992. He died in 2008. Orville Alderson had a small role as Mrs. Hamilton's butler, Stevens. Alderson began his career during the silent movie years in 1918. One movie that I remember him from is Sergeant York, 1941. His last movie was The Spirit of St. Louis, 1957. He died in 1957 at the age of 74. Carolyn Grimes played Debbie Brown, daughter of Julia and Henry. She also played Zazu in It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. Story: on a snowy Christmas night, the coolest guy in the world walks the streets of New York. The first time you see him, he is framed against the angels in the department store window. As he enjoys seeing the happy people, he does good deeds. He helps a blind man across the street by stopping cars. He saves a baby in a runaway buggy and nicely lectures a mother on safety. He sees a very attractive woman admiring a fancy hat in a store window. She seems very sad and alone. She crosses the street and we hear the voice of Professor Worthridge, Monty Woolley. He greets the woman as dear old friend Julia Brougham, Loretta Young. The professor says he has no religion, but he is getting a tree because it reminds him of his childhood. The professor asks about Henry. Julia seems sad and replies that he is very tired. The professor comments about the cathedral Henry is trying to build, and Julia asks about the book on Roman history that the professor is writing. As they part, the professor gives Julia an old Roman coin for the cathedral fund. Julia starts crying and says she wishes they were back in the old neighborhood where they were happy. When Julia leaves, the coolest guy in the world is standing behind the professor. He introduces himself to the professor like they are old friends. He says he knows Julia and that she is unhappy. They see Henry's old church and it is about to be shut down. As they part, the professor is still not sure he knows the man. When Julia gets home, the door is opened by the maid Matilda, Elsa Lancaster. She finds her husband, Henry Brougham, David Niven, who is an Episcopal bishop, in a meeting with the cathedral committee, which is really just the rich widow Mrs. Hamilton, Gladys Cooper. Mrs. Hamilton is obsessed with making the cathedral a monument to her late husband. Henry is opposed to this glorification, and Mrs. Hamilton leaves and threatens to not fund the cathedral if she can't have her way. Julia and Henry start arguing about the cathedral, and it is apparent that their marriage is strained. The bishop's personal secretary, Mildred Castaway, Sarah Hayden, informs him that he has an important call, even though the couple is already very late for their dinner. Julia gives Henry the coin from the professor, and he tosses it aside with contempt, and he calls his old friend a fool. He snaps at Julia, and they sit down to dinner in a very sad mood. Henry makes a date with his wife for the next day, including lunch at Michel's. Henry goes to the phone, and Mrs. Castaway reminds him that he has appointments all day, and then she leaves for the night. Henry bows his head before a painting of the proposed cathedral and prays for help. The painting glows, and Henry hears the door open, but when he looks, there is no one there. When Henry turns back, the coolest guy in the world is standing below the picture with his face hidden in darkness. The man tells him he has come in answer to his prayers, and he is an angel. He introduces himself as Dudley, Cary Grant. Julia comes in, and Dudley introduces himself as Henry's new assistant.
How do you do, Julia? I'm Dudley. Henry is engaging me to help him with his work.
You mean you're going to be his assistant?
That's it. I'm going to try to help Henry to rest and get some relaxation.
That's what I've been praying for.
You too?
She says she has been praying for that as well. When Julia meets Dudley, she immediately becomes happy. When Henry turns his back, Dudley disappears. Matilda and the other maid talk about Henry having a rough night and not wanting to eat his breakfast. Henry comes down the stairs looking hungover, and when he sees Mrs. Castaway, she lets him know that hardly any money is coming in for the cathedral. Matilda opens the door, and Dudley acts like he knows her already. When Mrs. Castaway comes by, he knows her as well. The two ladies are charmed by him. Julia comes down, and Henry breaks the date. Julia suggests Dudley stand in for him at the meeting, but Henry says no. Julia lets Matilda have the day off to shop for Christmas and agrees to take care of her own child. Wow. Dudley asks if Henry wants the cathedral or Julia's happiness. After Henry leaves, Dudley meets Julia and Henry's daughter, Debbie, Carolyn Grimes. Dudley pockets the professor's Roman coin and uses magic to do the filing he was supposed to do. As Dudley gets ready to go out, Matilda fawns over him, giving him the bishop's scarf to wear.
Oh, thank you, Matilda.
Aren't you going to wear a hat?
I never use one.
Oh, it's very cold outside.
Oh, well, the cold never affects me.
I think you should wear this anyway. I bought it for the bishop last Christmas, but he's never worn it.
Oh, it's a lovely scarf, Matilda. I'm sure the bishop will appreciate it when he sees it on me.
Julia is watching the kids' snowball fight in the park, and Debbie comes back crying because they won't let her play. Dudley shows up and has her pitch a magic curveball snowball, knocking defense captain Robert J. Anderson off the hill, winning a spot on the team. When I read the IMDb listing for an attack captain and a defense captain, I thought I had forgotten some civil defense part of the movie. You know, I'm a child of the Cold War. I expected it to be something like In the Time Machine 1960, when the air raid marshal was ordering everyone underground before the mushrooms started sprouting. But alas, it was just about the snowball fight. Matilda comes back, having finished all her Christmas shopping in record time.
But here's Matilda now.
If you wish... Oh, hello.
Hello.
If you wish, I'll take Debbie home, Mrs. Brougham.
But Matilda, you're shopping it.
Oh, I finished it. I finished it so quick, it was just like a miracle.
She takes Debbie to the house, while Dudley and Julia have the date that Henry and Julia should have had. Dudley takes Julia to Michelle's, and they are having a great time. Some church ladies are at the other table starting to gossip. Dudley goes over and charms them, and he invites them to join the pair. Henry cancels all his appointments and comes home to find out that Julia is out with Dudley. He's pissed. Julia and Dudley end up at the hat store, and the professor comes by and meets them on the street. The professor invites the two up for a drink of sherry. Dudley keeps using magic to refill the glasses. The professor admits he hasn't written anything in 20 years. He laments the sadness of his life.
I'll tell you about my book. For 20 years I've been talking about it. I've been promising the publishers that it will be delivered next spring. The funny part of it is, in all that time, I haven't written one word. Not one word.
Why not?
Well, I couldn't think of anything original to say. It was the same old monotonous history, dry as dust. It's the whole story of my life. Frustration. It's a chronic disease, and it's incurable.
Dudley pulls out the coin and explains that the coin is the last of 100 coins Julius Caesar used to pay for Cleopatra's lodging in Rome, and that Julius Caesar's wife had all of the others melted into jewelry for herself. Dudley tells the professor he will write the new information and finish his book before he dies. When Julia and Dudley leave, the bottle of sherry refills. Dudley and Julia come into the house, and Henry is still cranked. Henry takes Dudley into his office and locks the door with a skeleton key. I know you've heard the term peeping through the keyhole, which is impossible to do now. But these older locks could be opened from either side. Henry demands proof that Dudley is an angel. Henry says he thinks Dudley is a demon and not an angel.
Can you prove to me that you are an angel? Proof? You mean a document? Well, surely you, of all people, should know that an angel needs no passport. I want to see you perform a miracle. What kind? Well, make this desk rise up and fly around the room. Please, Henry, I didn't come down here to do silly tricks. I'm surprised at you. I don't believe you're an angel. I think you're a demon right out of... Oh, Henry, don't say that.
Dudley walks over and opens the locked door, leaving Henry behind. When Henry gets to the door, it is still locked, and he has to use the key to get out. Dudley joins Julia and Henry for dinner, and even Henry's dog has gone over to Dudley. The next morning, Henry tries to tell Julia that he loves her, but he can't get the words out. She reminds him that he is supposed to go to St. Timothy's for choir practice that evening. Dudley is downstairs charming Debbie and the older women with his tales of the Bible. Henry sets up a meeting with Mrs. Hamilton. When Dudley asks to come along, Henry refuses. Julia says the appointment will interfere with the choir practice. Henry goes to Mrs. Hamilton's house and gives in, giving her everything she wants concerning the cathedral. She even asks that the St. George on a stained glass fighting the dragon be made to look like her late husband.
Now, that large window depicting St. George and the dragon.
Yes?
I should very much like the countenance of St. George. Suggests my late husband.
Yes. Who do you see as the dragon?
Oh, any dragon.
When Henry tries to leave, his pants are stuck to the chair. At St. Timothy's, the preacher is nervous because only a few boys have shown up. Dudley uses his powers, and the boys enter in twos and threes and create the most beautiful sound. Dudley hails a cab driven by Sylvester, James Gleason. Julia sees a hat in the shop being purchased. Dudley convinces a fat lady not to buy the hat so Julia can have it. Julia asks to be driven through the park, and Dudley saves the cab from hitting a truck. Julia, Henry, and Sylvester stop by the skating rink. This part is really well done, and you can't see the professional skaters slip in to replace the actors. When Julia and Dudley get home, Henry is pissed again. Henry tries to send Dudley away, but he won't go. Dudley asks if Henry asked Mrs. Hamilton to give the money to the poor instead of building the cathedral. Dudley leaves, and Henry rages at Julia again. On Christmas Eve day, all of the females in the house are sad that Dudley is not there. Henry asks Mrs. Castaway to work late, typing his sermon, as he and Julia head out for the Christmas Eve visit. Sylvester is waiting outside with his cab. Dudley appears behind Mrs. Castaway. He says he will type the sermon so she can go home for Christmas. Dudley burns Henry's sermon and uses his power to make the typewriter pound out a different one. Dudley then uses his powers to decorate the tree for Matilda. Dudley arrives at Mrs. Hamilton's house before Julia and Henry. The butler, Stevens, Ervil Alderson, tries to stop Dudley, but Dudley uses the Jedi mind trick to get past. While Dudley is waiting, the harp plucks a few notes while Dudley is unlocking a box. Inside, he finds some musical manuscripts with a love note from a man that was not Mrs. Hamilton's husband. Dudley puts the sheets back and then plays the music on the harp as Mrs. Hamilton arrives. She tells Dudley that it was written by the only man she ever loved and that she only married her husband because he had money. She starts crying on Dudley's shoulder, and before she is done, she has decided to give the money to the poor. When Julia and Henry get there, Mrs. Hamilton is like Scrooge on Christmas morning. Henry is mad that Dudley has been there. Henry leaves the two ladies and ends up at the professor's home. The professor shows the refilling bottle, and he says it causes inspiration and not drunkenness. The professor can now read ancient languages. The professor says Dudley is not a mortal man, and Henry confirms that he is an angel. Henry tells the professor that he is worried about losing Julia to Dudley. The professor reminds Henry that he is the cause of the problems in the marriage and that he has an advantage over an angel. He is a mortal man, and Julia is a mortal woman, and that Henry should fight for her.
You know, Henry, it seems strange. I mean, you being a bishop and I a broken down old scholar, but I feel terribly sorry for you. I wish there was something I could do to help.
Well, thank you, but there's nothing to be done.
But there must be. You and Julia love each other. You always have.
It's only partially true. I love Julia.
Well, then why don't you fight for her?
Back at the house, Dudley implies to Julia that he has fallen for her. She immediately sends him away, saying that he should never return. Dudley and Henry face off for the final time.
I've never before had to fight an angel, but I suggest you take off your coat and put up your dukes.
Henry says Julia means more to him than life. Dudley smiles and says good. Now he will be leaving. Dudley also says that no one will remember him ever being there. Dudley says that Henry's prayer had been answered. Henry states that he prayed for a cathedral. Dudley replies, "No, Henry, you prayed for guidance. That has been given to you." Dudley says that he has been envying Henry, and that is a danger signal and that he must leave and never come back. As Dudley leaves, the picture of the cathedral lights up again. All memories of Dudley are erased, leaving only a Christmas angel behind for Debbie. Henry shows true love for Julia at last. Julia and Henry go to St. Timothy's, where Henry delivers Dudley's sermon. The professor looks into the smiling face of Dudley on the street, but does not recognize him. Henry/Dudley's sermon ends with filling Jesus' stocking with gifts of loving kindness, warm hearts, and a stretched out hand of tolerance. All the shining gifts that make peace on earth. World famous short summary: Angel uses trickery to force a man to do the right thing. Okay, folks, it's time to sign up for my email list, as the free EPUB for subscribers will be released in early January. It's around 200 pages, has 50 reviews that are cleaned and cross-referenced, and original artwork. If you want a copy, it's completely free to list members. If you enjoyed this week's show, please tell your friends, and if you really want to help, drop on over to iTunes and give me a review. If you want to comment, recommend a movie, or just say hi, follow the links in the show notes to my site. I have SpeakPipe so you can leave audio feedback as well. Beware the Moors.